and the Puppet Master. And it's Chris's discourse on why we need to champion left pluralism and defeat the siren voices of left populism. So the book, The Dark Night, was first published as Warring Fictions by Policy Network and Rowman and Littlefield at the end of last year. And the good thing is, actually, I can spy a number of you on the call who joined us at the launch of that edition back in the bygone days of actual meetings in the Mary Sumner Centre. To start off with, I make no bones about the fact that I think that this is a fantastic book. And I was really pleased that Chris approached us to help him launch it this time round. I think it's thought-provoking, it's well written, and he provides us with very clear arguments of where he thinks we need to be going, the direction of travel for the next couple of years. So when I read the first edition, the book very much felt like a warning. I think reading what Chris had to write in January, February of this year, when everything was so febrile and the world felt a much darker place, actually made me worry about the future. I think reading this book afresh at the end of the year, following the rise and fall of Corbyn, Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, the book now strikes me as being a much more optimistic text, as much of a how-to as it is a how not to book and guide for the future. That's enough from me, though. Shortly, I'm going to ask Chris to present his case, and is going to talk us through it in some detail in a compelling presentation he's put together for us, which should take us up to about 25 past 6. After that, we've asked two very distinguished guests to provide us with their thoughts on Chris's case. First, I'll be asking Deborah Mattinson to speak. Now, Deborah is the founder of Britain Thinks, and it was the former pollster for Labour Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and as many of you will know, has recently published a book herself, doing some research behind the so-called Red Wall into what Labour might have to do to win back some of its former heartland areas. And after that, I'm asking Peter Kyle. Peter is the MP for Hove, the Shadow Minister for Victims and Youth Justice, and wearing the snazziest T-shirt on the screen tonight. Like I said, they're both then going to come in and reflect on Chris's case. I might then ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the room. So what we'll do is what we normally do at Progress events on Zoom. Feel free to ask questions in the comment box to the side of the screen, and then Joseph, Frankie and I will go through, we'll pick out the best questions and ask you to read them on camera. And if you don't want to be on camera, let us know. I'm not going to embarrass you for the sake of it. So that's enough from me for the time being. Over to Chris.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nathan, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much, Nathan, for the introduction. And thank you to everyone at Progress and at Penguin. And I also wanted to thank Policy Network and Rowman and Littlefield, who published Warring Fictions, which was essentially the first edition of this book. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. I think I should be able to do that. Everyone can see that, I hope. Great. So I'll just start with a little bit of context. I'm going to whiz quite quickly through the content of the book. But to begin with a bit of context, the last decade was a really terrible period for Labour and for the left and for progressive politics in general. We are more divided, or we spent much of the decade more divided than almost at any point in the party's history, and we're further from power than we were at the start of the decade. Obviously, this was summed up by the disastrous election result in December the 12th, 2019. There's a lot of theories about what went wrong. You know, ranging from simply that during the second part of that period we lurched to the left, through to just 100% plonking the blame on Jeremy Corbyn's shoulders. And whilst I am sympathetic to both of those views, I think as a party and progressive politics in general, we need to look deeper than just how left-wing or right-wing policies are, and we need to look deeper than just the individual leadership at a particular point in time. But the reason why I started writing the book was because I felt that the real problems on the left related to a kind of populist mentality, and to some of the kind of populist narratives which come with that mentality. This is an issue that was bigger than Corbyn, in my view, even though he kind of epitomised the problem and allowed these narratives free rein. So in my view, really was that the problem, Labour's problem, and when it has problems in its history, is because it bleeds into becoming a populist party of easy answers and us against them struggle, rather than that it falls into being too much of a socialist party. So my argument is that we need to turn the tank around, basically, and put the 2010s behind us, and that to do this, we need to embrace pluralism and remove the narratives which prop up left populism. Okay, so I'm going to start in a slightly unusual place, but on the screen there you've got a picture of the philosopher John Rawls. For those not familiar with John Rawls, he was a political philosopher. He wrote A Theory of Justice in 1971, and his view about his essential question was, how would you design the world if you didn't know who you'd been born as within it? So his argument was that an objective society would be a fair society, and his definition of fairness was based on equal rights, so everyone had absolute equality of rights, absolute equality of opportunities, and absolutely fair outcomes. What he meant by fair outcomes was that you needed a society in which, if there were inequalities, they benefited the poor or the least privileged in society more than the most privileged. I start by summing up this philosophy, and I won't go through it in a lot of detail, but because I think it's really important for us to talk about what is the ideal, what is an ideal which those across the left could agree upon, what's a kind of yardstick against which we can measure how successful we are, and what is something that would essentially unite the different wings of Labour and of the left in general. And this, I start the book by talking about this idea of equal rights, equal opportunities, fair outcomes as something which I believe could be kind of an ideal or a goal that we should strive for as a movement. So, what stops us getting to a place of equal rights, equal opportunities, and fair outcomes? In the book, I spend the majority of the rest of it arguing against three myths which I believe define left populism and get in the way of progressive goals at every juncture. And I've kind of summed them up with the little triangle there on the side. These myths are the dark knight, that's knight with a K, as in the kind of white knight versus dark knight, which is the idea of an evil right-wing enemy. The puppet master, which is the idea of an all-powerful elite shaping our lives. And the golden era, which is the idea of a kind of a glorious socialist past lost to modernity. These ideas, in my view, cloud our judgment, lead us down blind alleys. They reinforce each other, creating a worldview based on struggle and loss, and they perpetually stop us from achieving a society based on equal rights, equal opportunities, and fair outcomes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each myth, and what you can see on the screen is a, so I'm just going to make it a bit bigger, hopefully that's a bit better. What you can see on the screen is a kind of collage or mood board that I've made for the Dark Knight, which is the first of the myths. So to explain what this myth is, this is essentially the idea that we live in a, this is essentially the idea that the political spectrum is a moral spectrum. It's a narrative that there's this kind of enemy that we must always be fighting against, that we must define ourselves against, and that populism, that politics essentially works on that basis. So what it does is it divides the world into victims and villains, goodies and baddies, the in-group and the out-group. It's the politics of class war, of Cold War, and more recently of the culture war, and it creates a whole set of political bogeymen, be it the bankers, the Tories, the Blairites, the Americans, which you can constantly define yourselves against. So it creates this idea that the political spectrum is a moral spectrum, and we are the good guys at one end of it. And it means that we invariably see it as our role to side with Russia against America on every question, with the public sector against the private sector on every question. It brings out the ideas of no enemies to the left, my enemy's enemy is my friend, the idea that you rise with your class, not out of it, a whole set of things which are about taking sides, which ultimately stem from this view that being on the left makes you moral, and the further to left you go, the more immoral, and the further to the right, the more self-interested and callous and malicious you are. So I've got lots of different examples dotted around the screen that show that. And in the book, I set out 4 problems with this myth. I'm not going to go through them in full detail right now. I'm not going to go through all 4 right at this second. And some of them are things which really should be quite obvious, but the idea that people throughout society are products of their life experience, the idea that individuals are complicated and have different elements of their identity. But one element to particularly focus on is that, in my view, these myths, this Dark Knight myth, creates a fundamental lack of trust in the Labour Party to govern. Because if we invest policies with innate morality, we cease to be credible. People think that our enthusiasm is limitless or inexorable. So people might support rail nationalisation, for example, but they don't trust Labour to do it because they feel that Labour invests it with moral status and would favour nationalisation on every other question as well. So those are the kind of the arguments against it, and I'll circulate these slides afterwards so that people can look at them in a bit more detail. Going on to the second myth, again, we've got one of these sort of collage-y mood board slides that I've created, and this is the puppet master myth. So what this is basically the idea that we live in a thinly disguised dictatorship rather than a broadly functioning democracy. So it takes the view that most problems are visited on us from above, they are authored by powerful elites, and it kind of takes the view that governments oppress willfully rather than mediating badly. And as a result of this, it sees agency and design everywhere, the powerful interests colluding with their agendas and all of this kind of thing. One of the first problems with the myth is that it creates oppositionism and easy answers. So it creates this kind of view of politics whereby all you need to do is you go into number 10 Downing Street and you turn the inequality dial down and you kind of switch the poverty button off. Essentially, it says that power is easy. So it makes us fundamentally ill-equipped to actually be in government. But the second element is that it represents the sort of thin end of the conspiracy theorist wedge. So it invariably leads Labour into the territory ultimately of kind of anti-Semitism. For example, you can see at the top there on that slide the famous mural by which Jeremy Corbyn defended a few years ago, where you've got this idea of this powerful group kind of controlling everyone else. And once you've come to that idea of the powerful group, inevitably, I think a lot of people move in the direction of looking, it flips the tracks into all out sort of racism. So there's within the book, I look at 4 fundamental arguments against the puppet master, which I'm not going to go through every single one of right now. But just one good example of a way of thinking about the puppet master myth is about the mainstream media, or MSM. So for the past few years, this idea of how the media operate has been absolutely central to the left populist analysis. I'm just going to read a quote from Jeremy Corbyn about how he thinks that the media operates. He says, "We just need to take on the power of the unaccountable media-owning billionaires who are holding us back from achieving what we can all achieve." And then just to read a quote from Tony Blair, who is no more positive about the media than Jeremy Corbyn, but he describes it as like a feral beast, just tearing people and reputations to bits. No one dares to miss out. And he criticises the media's scale, its weight, its constant hyperactivity. So both of these views are not at all sympathetic towards the British media and how it operates, but they have come from a fundamentally different place. And Jeremy Corbyn's is absolutely a puppet master analysis of where the media is coming from, which says it's a kind of propaganda machine for a powerful elite, rather than something more anarchic and chaotic. Okay, so the third myth, and again I've got one of my my collages here. The third myth is the golden era, and this is a bit different to some of the other myths, but what it essentially comprises is the idea that the idea of a socialist Arcadia, which has been lost to the modern world. So it paints this idea of an original socialism, a kind of really a simple, natural order of things, which has been polluted by the modern world. The lifeblood of this myth is the quote, neoliberalism narrative, a woolly and ill-defined term, but which is used to not just to describe economic inequality having risen, for example, which has happened, but to agglomerate a whole set of other things, be it climate change, civil liberties, consumerism, Western foreign policy, within this narrative of decline, where we're kind of gradually moving towards this right-wing reactionary dystopia. So there's a number of problems with this myth. Again, it's one of the characteristics of it is it sees very little in the positive in the modern world. It's very dissatisfied with the present, and it kind of has nothing to say for the future. And within the party democracy, what it tends to do is it tends to see contemporary Labour leaders as sellouts, who are kind of, so each of Clement Attlee, Harold Wilson, Tony Blair, as they left power, was regarded as a sellout, unfit to lace the boots of their socialist forefathers. And it was only as they faded into the past that some of those figures became kind of rehabilitated in a sense. So again, in the book, I actually look at 7 sort of alternatives to this very simplistic golden era narrative, where we've gone from a progressive socialist society to a right-wing neoliberal one. And again, I'm not going to read all of these out in detail, but each of them looks to identify and tease out a more nuanced story of what's happened in the last 70 years than the golden era or neoliberalism narrative. So for example, we look at what's happened with the move from isolation to interconnectedness. We're in a much, much more interconnected world, which means fluid capital, which kind of benefits, benefits the right, if you like, but at the same time free movement, which makes us a much more, I think, progressive and liberal world. So in a sense, with the modern world, it's quite hard to have one of those without the other. But the golden era myth pretends that you can, or pretends that things were perfect in the past, and that these trade-offs between past and present don't exist. So I've outlined the 3 myths, and the things that they share a number of characteristics. The first thing they share is a purity of purpose and a sense of this valiant struggle. They share ultimately, though, a lack of constructive solutions. So the puppet master myth, for example, encourages the idea that politics is easy and really you just need to get in the driving seat, and there aren't these trade-offs, and difficult priorities don't really exist. They create the mirage of a utopia, so you never quite get to the place, but they create this castle on the hill that you can never quite reach. And in that respect, each of them relies on the left being out of power. It relies on us. It relies on there being a right-wing enemy who we haven't won over. We haven't convinced them. We need to fight them. It relies on there being a puppet master in government who isn't us. So it provides really for the left a whole set of excuses for failure, which condemn us to being an opposition party, really, and condemns Labour to being an opposition party. Just to give an example of this, my argument, I should emphasise, although I'm very critical of Corbynism in the book, my argument is that this has dogged Labour throughout its history, really. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, what you've got is a letter which Clement Attlee wrote to Nye Bevan, criticising Nye Bevan's description of the Conservatives as being, quote, lower than vermin. Nye Bevan made that statement shortly before the creation of the NHS. And Clement Attlee's criticism of that kind of very dark night, populist, loaded description of the Tories as vermin was that not just that it was kind of not the right thing to say and not an ethical or nice thing to say, but also that it completely undermined what Labour was trying to do on the NHS, because it gave credibility to the argument that we were swivel-eyed, us and them types, rather than pragmatists doing the right thing for the country. So, coming to the end of it now, sorry. So we kind of find ourselves here at the end of what I would call a kind of low dishonest decade, to quote W.H. Auden. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is some evidence of the clouds passing. So you've got on the left there not only Joe Biden, obviously winning on a platform based on our enemies, our opponents not being our enemies. But you've also got Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, who ran on a platform on the basis of politics not needing to be divisive. And of course, we've got Keir Starmer, who I hope and I believe has Labour to turn its back on some of the, particularly the puppet master conspiracy theorist arguments that dominated for the last few years. So I'm just going to give a quote here from it's at the start of the book, and it's a quote which I took from a review of Citizen Clem, the biography of Clement Attlee, and I just wanted to read this quote in full. It says, "The true progressive giants, like Clement Attlee, are radicals of the real, those who accept that democracy implies pluralism and that plural society is self-evidently made up of many people and kinds, only a few of them truly exploitative and criminal, most just pursuing their own version of the good life, as tradition and conviction has offered it to them." So this is, I wanted to read that quote because I thought that was a really powerful quote of, in a way, articulating what a kind of left pluralist, progressive pluralist movement needs to look like. I feel like that quote is something which we need to almost have as a bit of a motto. And what it showed to me is that a lot of people like to talk about the kind of approach to politics I'm advancing as being centrist or middle ground or technocratic in some way. But it doesn't need to be. There is nothing inherently right-wing or centrist about pluralism. It's just a different way of seeing politics. So to sort of wrap things up, I wanted to just talk about how, this is the final slide, and it's about how we might actually achieve a politics based on left pluralism, how we need to start changing and seeing things. So some of this is stuff which I think is a statement of the obvious in a certain respect, but what the last 10 years, particularly the last 5 years, have shown us, if anything, is that these things aren't, I don't think, obvious to everyone, and our politics in many ways has moved further and further from the acknowledgements I make on this slide. So my definition of left pluralism is a democratic socialist politics which subscribes to the following analysis. 1, we live in a democracy, and this implies pluralism. 2, there are a range of respectable ideals and values which people strive for. Understanding this relies on giving others the benefit of the doubt. 3, few policies are inherently moral, even if they are right at a given time. 4, society's problems are not usually deliberately authored. 5, the power held by democratic governments, the media and business is finite. It does exist, but it's not limitless, it's finite, and it's not as big as we imagine. 6, objectivity is more important than political faith in achieving our values. 7, there have been advances and setbacks, but there was no moment of original socialism which was innately superior to today. 8, cooperation with other countries is part of the modern world. If we derive our, it's part of the modern world. 9, if we derive our passion solely from fighting an enemy, an elite, or a looming dystopia, then we stand for nothing. And finally, 10, accepting the above things makes us more likely, not less, to achieve progressive goals. So these are in a way, I've kind of jokingly called them at the first launch a kind of sort of 10 commandments, but I think they're ways of seeing the world which are, they're not about left and right, but they are about how we can start to understand the world in a way that makes it possible to be a successful progressive party. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to that. I hope I haven't run over too much. And I'm now going to hand back to Nathan. Thanks a lot.
Okay, fantastic, Chris. I mean, it's really good to see so many yellow hands of applause and thumbs up. I mean, again, I know I mentioned at the beginning, I think this book is fantastic, and I would recommend that everybody went out and read it, because even Chris's presentation, which was really good and clear, doesn't do his work any justice whatsoever. All I would say, though, is if there are any Blairite American bankers on the call tonight, you are obviously in like the 7th circle of hell, as far as the leftist populists in the party might think. So you have hopes and prayers, comrades, hopes and prayers. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to ask Deborah to speak, and then I think I'll go straight into Peter after that. So Pete, no need to worry for me to fanning around in between. And then after they've spoken, I'll kick off with a question I've got from an audience member. Then we'll see how the evening rolls. I think Deborah's got to go about just after 7 o'clock, but we can carry on a bit longer after she leaves. So Deborah, over to you.
Brilliant, thanks Nathan, and thanks very much Chris for the presentation as well. My book only arrived on Saturday, but I was gripped by it on Sunday and raced through it and pretty much finished it. I really liked the analysis and I really enjoyed it. I think it's a really kind of clear and compelling and recognisable account, both actually of the appeal of Corbynism and also what was wrong with it. And one of the things that struck me in particular that I wanted to just focus on a little bit was Chris's identification of this sort of incredibly powerful sense of moral superiority that is held by many on the left. And that was something that I had obviously come across many times. When I was researching my book, Beyond the Red Wall, one of the people that I interviewed was a Tory strategist called James Canagasorian, who is actually famous for coining the phrase the Red Wall and coming up with the concept. He's a very smart guy, and I interviewed him and asked him what he thought had happened in the Red Wall. And he told me that he believed that Labour's downfall fundamentally lay in the fact, and I'm quoting him here now, that Labour lacks intellectual humility, that they see voting Labour as a moral duty, and that this has led to strategic blindness. Labour think they have a moral right to 50% of the vote. And I thought that was really interesting and quite chilling, and very much supports, I think, some of the points that Chris made. I would actually go further, because I think we talk about moral superiority, but then the flip side of that is these poor voters often that have this moral inferiority. And that is something that I heard again and again in the Red Wall. And I'll come back to that, but one of the things I've noticed, for example, is that when I tweet something about Red Wall voters, I'm often inundated, and that's not an exaggeration, literally inundated, by lots of angry tweets that question why I've spent so much time and why I'm encouraging them to spend time listening to the views of people who are, quote, racists, idiots, etc., etc. And when I tweeted on Saturday evening, amid all the kind of glorious and giddy joyousness of it all, that in my opinion, it would be very important for the Democrats to understand the motivations of the 70+ million people, 70+ million people who voted for Trump. Again, I was inundated with furious and self-righteous replies. One, for instance, this is just one, I could have picked one, there were many, said, what utter nonsense. You can't understand racism, xenophobia, misogyny, etc. He, it always is a he, had sort of run out of adjectives then. And he summed it up, you can't compromise on values. And I felt this sort of summed up the problem. And when we look at why the Red Wall fell, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that, being on the wrong side, apparently, of that moral superiority was very often at the heart of those voters' rejection of Labour. The sense that Labour was, as one person put it to me, a group of snooty London graduates who looked down their nose at people like them. Now, this wasn't, and I think Chris makes the point too, just a product of Corbyn's leadership. But I think it's fair to say that it became turbocharged under Corbyn's leadership. But it had been a long time coming. And I think all of those of us, and there have been many people on this call, including me, who are part of this, who have allowed that drift to happen over quite a long time. And the party had been drifting away from those voters for a long time, leaving them feeling dismissed, neglected, and sneered at. And I've in the past, I've often talked about this, you know, if you personify the Labour Party, if it was a person, what would it cook you for dinner? Back in the day when I first worked for Labour in the 80s, it was a pie and a pint. It then morphed into a sort of sausage en croûte and a craft beer. And now it's quinoa. So the myths that Chris challenges so eloquently, the Dark Knight, the enemy we all want to defeat, the puppet master, you know, the kind of equally evil, all-powerful forces that plot behind the scenes in the golden era are all core elements for all forms of political populism, as he points out. But I'd argue that also the core elements of great storytelling, and that's what makes them compelling, and that's why they work. And I would also argue that they are, to a degree, successful elements of all successful campaigns. And it's interesting, Biden, who Chris pulled out as an example of populism, actually his campaign theme was the battle for the soul of the nation. I mean, it was very much about purifying a problem. It was very much about fighting evil. And although all the remarks he's made since then, thankfully, have been quite conciliatory, and I believe that he is a pluralist, of course, I still think that that's something that we need to bear in mind. But this is something, this is not a new story. Trump talked about making America great again, not just making it great. That this whole thing about nostalgia, the golden era for the Red Wallers that I've been listening to was when their country and their communities were respected, when they worked hard for fair pay. And I think nostalgia is particularly powerful. That golden era really matters if your future feels very, very uncertain. So I also agree with Chris, and I think this is really vital, that it must be possible to identify a destination that we can all agree on, his castle on the hill that we all want to inhabit. And I think in the end, the left and progressives do best when they are preoccupied with what the goal is and how best to articulate that, rather perhaps than how to get there. And this also always involves some kind of compromise. But if the vision is inspirational enough, it's possible to bring different, sometimes warring factions or warring fictions, as Chris would have it, together. And this was brought home to me very vividly in some work that I did for Labour Together after the last election, where we ran a citizens' jury of different Labour tribes, some Red Wallers and what we termed urban Remainers, people who had stuck with Labour, together for a 2-day citizen jury to see how we could, if we could, and how we could broker some kind of, agreed way forward. And it was tricky. So we got people working separately in tribes like themselves initially. We asked them to sketch out their ideal party. The telling point was when they talked about who would be the ideal leaders of their ideal parties, because urban Remainers' ideal was maybe a young David Attenborough or somebody like Michelle Obama, while the Red Wallers' ideal leader was perhaps Alan Sugar or Tim Martin, or Tim Weatherspoon as they called him, but they meant Tim Martin. However, in the end, they were able and willing to broker a compromise. Everyone wanted to succeed, although there was clearly no magic bullet. And that takes me to the final point really that I wanted to make, is what I think the challenge underlying the book, and it hints at it, doesn't fully address it, and that's not a criticism, because maybe that's your sequel, Chris, but is actually how you get to the point where you really start to shape out what ideal looks like. Chris accuses populism of representing the deferral rather than the fulfillment of that utopian dream, a style of politics offering purpose and struggle but doing little to make things better for ordinary people. And he acknowledges that society's never perfect. We should just focus on making it better. But articulating what that looks like and how we get there, I think, is the task ahead. And as he says, it should be about meaningful achievement rather than chasing rainbows. The landslide victory in 1997 promised nothing more than things can only get better. And if we can really work to understand the grievances of those people that have abandoned the left, abandoned progressives, abandoned Labour, Red Wallers, and more, and what better would really look like for them and their communities, and how to paint a picture of the future that's as tangible and appealing as the past that they currently yearn for, then I think that we might just be in with a shout. And I think what the book does is to start to sort of pave the way to start that happening.
I'm going to jump straight in, and it is a pleasure to follow you, Deborah. And Chris, I really enjoyed the book, and thank you so much for having me. Let me just say before I carry on that there's a lot of activity in the Commons at the moment, and you'll hear a lot of noises going, and probably a lot of bells in a minute. But I have a proxy for this evening, so I don't have to rush off and vote when all those noises do, but I do apologise for all of the racket that's going on. I think, Chris, that what you presented with is the first kind of framework that is really helpful for people to try and understand and contextualise what we've all been through. All of us on this call, all of the people who have been in and around the Labour movement in the last 5 years, whether you are part of the populist left or different points on the political spectrum, have experienced different things. And I think that what you've done is provide a framework to help understand it, because at the moment, for people like me, it is still a very emotional and quite a raw period to reflect on. And I'd be very interested to see at some point when people from the left or the populist left do read the book, whether actually it helps, whether it provides a framework that they too can help understand that period, because it is really important to try and take some of the emotion and rawness away from it and just try and actually understand what happened. I think that's why I'm here tonight, because I was participant in some of this as it unfolded, because as a newly elected MP in 2015, very, very shortly before Jeremy Corbyn got elected, I was kind of there when a lot of this happened, and a lot of it weirdly sucked me up into the maelstrom of it. I hate talking about it. It's quite difficult for me to talk about it, but I will on this occasion, because I think actually it provides a different narrative for the discussion that we're having tonight. You know, I think that firstly, you need to kind of understand where I came from. And I think this is quite important for the pluralism side of the debate that we had, because quite a lot of people like me on this part of the political spectrum, you know, and the second reason why it's quite difficult for me to read this book, not only was it pulling me back into an era that I am desperate to escape, and that Keir's election has allowed me and others to escape. Also, it felt reading this book, Chris, like you were reaching into my political soul, because when you were describing the plural left, we all think that we're individuals and there's no one else like us. I'm like everybody else, and think that it is completely inconceivable that anybody else is motivated by the same things as me, or thinks and responds in the same way that I do. But actually, when you describe the plural left, I realized that actually you were describing me with almost uncanny accuracy. But the thing is about me and why I'm plural, my upbringing, you know, my dad, in his words, says that he grew up in a slum in Liverpool. He had a really extraordinary degree of poverty in his background. He left school at 14, was in the Navy at 16, was a door-to-door salesman in his mid-20s. And when I was growing up, Dad left the Navy by then. My dad's three best friends, one was a builder, one owned a carpet wholesaler, and the other was a plumber. And the conversation around these people was vigorous, it was charismatic, it was noisy, it was incredibly opinionated, but never ever disrespectful. There was always a real underlying respect around the table, around the garden table if there was a barbecue. But there was lots of cigarettes, lots of drink, but it was a really powerful experience for me. None of them were anchored in a political tradition, but they were all incredibly opinionated and had a lot to say about the world. But it certainly, you know, I grew up in an environment where that kind of discourse was celebrated and embraced. And I just assumed that would, and still do to this day, that is the kind of thing that most people have experienced. And actually that's how political discourse should be. But 6 months after I got elected in 2015, I had the most extraordinary experience, because I thought at that point in 2015, where we had a huge campaign, there are people on this call who I can see were very, very participant in that 2015 election. And I know that you know what it took to win that election and the hard work it took, and the fact that it wasn't just me, but we did have a very, very focused campaign. But 6 months after that election, I had the unusual experience of seeing two documentaries viewing on primetime TV on the same night, one Panorama and one Dispatches, and both of whom had secretly, covertly filmed my CLP and branches in my CLP, planning to have me deselected. It was an extraordinary thing for me to sit and watch. I only watched one of them. But my dad and my family were watching and were calling up and describing. And when you hear the hurt that they saw, I felt confusion. They felt, you know, real pain when they saw this. But what they saw when I was being described was that they were that words such as, you know, traitor, many times I was described as lacking values, Tory-lite, careerist, all of these sorts of things were being used to describe me 6 months after I got elected. Incidentally, 6 months after I defeated a Tory, we in Hove defeated a Tory in a general election that was the worst showing for Labour in 35 years, and only 10 candidates defeated Tories. Now, I now know, reading your book, what they were trying to do was paint me as a dark knight. And I think it is a very helpful way of trying to understand from their perspective, actually what was happening in that period. You know, and I thought long and hard, really very long and hard, about what motivated that behavior. And also that was the tip of the iceberg, because then, you know, when it was dragged out into the light, there was no hiding it. So branch meetings, CLP meetings were very painful experiences to go through because of the way that, you know, I was treated and being treated. Not just me, in fact, much more difficult for me was seeing people who I had known and loved, had loving friendships with for many years, being treated in quite a brutal and appalling way. But what I concluded in that time was that they had decided, the people who were acting in that way, had decided that I was unprincipled. Why had they decided that I was unprincipled? Because when you decide that somebody is unprincipled, then you no longer have to go through the hassle of trying to change their mind. You know, in politics, for me, it's about changing minds. It's about winning arguments. It's about progress, moving forward. That is politics, is progress for me. But when you decide that somebody is fundamentally unprincipled, you give up on trying to change their mind because it's impossible. And once you decide that somebody is unprincipled, then you don't need to change their mind. All you need to do is get them to the position you want them in. And any methods used for doing so is worth it. It's game on, it's allowed, because they don't have principles, so you can't treat them in a principled way. That's what it felt like to me, and that was what a conclusion I came to many years ago. So it's interesting seeing Chris now put a framework around this, because we saw a lot of language of loyalty around that time. And the loyalty for me was a really interesting one, because I was many times asked, be loyal to the leader, even though that, most of the time I'd never said anything against him. It was just that I wasn't acting in a way that they decided was loyal. But actually, when you look at it, it wasn't loyalty that was being asked of me and others, it was obedience. And this is a really important distinction. For all the times that I was ordered to get behind Jeremy, I was never asked to stand alongside Jeremy, which I would have thought in a socialist organization would be the sort of thing that we should be doing. I was twice asked and presented with an oath of loyalty to Jeremy, which I think is a complete anathema in the kind of organization that we aspire to be, and the way we aspire to act as an organization, to inspire loyalty, inspire comradeship, inspire the kind of teamwork and feeling of common bonds that would come with it. So this was the way that I started to perceive the book, the way that things were unfolding at the time. So the book is great at placing a broader context on the populism of the time. And I think that the term the populist left is accurate. Now, Chris, you called in your book simplicity the final allure of the Dark Knight. And I think that is really helpful, because we live in an era that is going to be defined by a virus. And I've come to the conclusion that when you look at actually what populism is, how populism acts, what we see is the breadth of color, diversity, complexity. You know, we live at an era which is defined by centuries of political traditions, centuries of economic evolution and progress, centuries and in fact decades of advances in quite difficult things for many people, such as equality and all its guises, which has presented challenges for many people. So if you boil all of that down into its simplest possible form, then I think you are devoid of all of the complexity and you have a very simple message. All of that complexity gone, all of the difficulties of understanding that complexity gone, and you have one simple message. Well, a virus on its own has no intellect. It has no empathy. It has no ability to act in a strategic way. But what we know about viruses is when you have enough numbers, it can penetrate the most extraordinary barriers. And that's what populism has done to our politics in recent times. It has penetrated and found a way in. Karl Marx said that Britain is the rock upon which the waves of revolution break. And he was right for so long. I mean, he came to live and work here for a reason, because our political system was so utterly robust that he could write his revolutionary thoughts and see it unfold on the continent, but it never actually lapped the shores that he chose to live in. And for a long time it was because we had a two-party state, which broadly, when you added the two parties together, the membership of which represented vast swathes of our country's voters, residents, citizens, because we had mass membership. The reason why the virus of populism finally penetrated our membership, our politics, I believe, is that the membership of both main parties has reduced in number massively. And in so doing, the people who are inspired to join political parties have increasingly been people who share an ideological view rather than a values-driven view and a pluralist view of politics. And what it has meant is that by co-opting and dominating the membership of a party, you can co-opt and dominate the politics at the very, very top of our parliamentary system. And that is what's essentially happened in recent years in both parties. And it culminated in the 2019 general election, which I felt so passionately was a failure of our body politic. I felt so passionately that presenting our public with a choice between a populist left and a populist right was not in the interests of our country and was beneath what I believe our body politic should represent and is capable of, that I actually voted against having the 2019 general election. One of only 6 Labour MPs that voted against having the general election because I felt so strongly about it. So we've got to the point where we have, because of the energy that came out of the 2019 general election was so strong that it actually was a political supernova. And it created such energy that it could actually allow Keir Starmer to come through and present a whole plethora of opportunities for us to move past. And the reason why I'm happy to speak in the terms that I am this evening is that we can only move forward if we really understand what's happened and the impact it's had on people and individuals. We can only move forward if we understand and put a framework around it. And that's why I think your book is very important. The only other thing I would add is that I think I would have liked you to write more about the sense of victimhood that fuels populism on the left and on the right. We see this in the States now, where suddenly Donald Trump is a victim of, we're not quite sure what, because it's hard to prove anything, but clearly he's a victim of the electorate at the moment who have voted against him, who he has boiled down into unknown people who have harnessed and stitched up the election over there without any evidence. And we see it also with people being revisionist about what actually happened and what the public were thinking in 2019. So we've got to be really careful, because the sense of victimhood, I think, is almost as powerful as the golden era strand of thinking which you've identified there. Thank you very much for having me along. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that provides a different perspective on the period that you've been writing about.
Excellent.
Okay, fantastic. Cheers, Pete. And thank you, Deborah. I basically agreed with everything. This is a jolly agreeable evening. I agree with everything the pair of you said. I mean, and definitely that last point, Pete, it was the really painful thing about last year was actually the growing realization that we were all being denied any sense of agency as to our role in the party. And I think that was one of the worst things that I realized last year is actually how do we break out of that construct that many of us felt we were stuck in. Now I'm conscious of the time. What I'm going to do, I've got 4 questions that I've chosen from the chat function. I'm going to ask them in 2 rounds, and I'm going to ask Deborah to go first, so we can get all those pearls of wisdom before 7:05. So the two members of the audience I would like to ask their questions, and ask them pithily, please, are Leo Gibbons and Stella Nabukira. And then after that, I'm going to go to David Arnold and to Siobhan Coughlin. But I'll take those 2 first, then get Deborah, Chris, and Pete to answer them. Then we'll come back for the second lot after Deborah leaves us.
Shall I go first?
Yes, please, Leo.
Yeah, thanks, Nathan. Oh gosh, I wasn't expecting to be chosen. I'll go with my first question. I assume that's the most pertinent. Let me just quickly find it. Yes, so essentially, how do we combat this idea that civility is the language of the elites, and that the louder your anger, your bile towards the Dark Knight, the more righteous and caring you are? There's this idea that somehow the old politics of the elites, of 2 centre parties being identical and being chummy, was somehow those 2 forces weren't caring about the wrongs that the other side were doing. So I'll just leave it there. Try and keep it sweet, short and sweet.
Great, thank you, Stella.
Okay, all right. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, mine is very simple, and I was just asking if there's any evidence, if there's any evidence that attitudes to gender, race, ethnicity affect pluralism.
Great stuff, thank you. So Deborah, then Chris, then Pete.
Sure. Okay, looking at Leo's question first. I mean, I'm not actually sure how much this is a problem with voters anyway. If in the end what we're thinking about with this conversation is ultimately what voters that we need to persuade might think, which I presume is where we would all be heading, I'm not sure how much this is a problem with them. That I think it is. I think what they do yearn and seek out is a feeling of authenticity. So if a politician's way of expressing and seeming authentic is to be forthright / rude about other people, then maybe that's where you're heading with that. I don't know, but certainly, voters that I listened to in the Red Wall, earlier this year, and then dipping back to them to see how they felt about events, they were drawn, interestingly, to Boris Johnson, and he personally played a huge part in the Tories. He gave people the license to vote Tory. One person said he de-snobified the Tory party. And one of the reasons why he did that was quite the opposite of what you're saying. There is a sense about him of him being sort of affable and civil. And I think that was one of his appeals. Jeremy Corbyn, on the other hand, did not seem to be so. He seemed to, he definitely spoke to all of this kind of looking down on them and people like them. Not particularly in an aggressive way. They didn't think he was aggressive. But I don't know how much a problem that is with ordinary voters, to be honest.
Sorry, Deborah, if I could just add to my question. It was, and it goes, also this goes to my sort of second question about it. I think I completely agree with you about the average voter. They like that idea of civility, of respect for your opponents and being affable and approachable. But when it comes to persuading the populist left, they see civility as an element of politics, and about persuading them. Now, how do you get that kind of the other side of the Labour tribe to listen to what Chris has to say? That's basically my second question as well.
Yeah. Okay, so that is more tricky. And I think that there is a breed of people in politics whose bread and butter is basically exactly what you're describing. And I'm not sure how you can persuade those people other than to persuade them that different behaviour is the only route to winning elections. If I felt really despairing, I might say that same group of people perhaps are less worried about whether or not they win an election and more worried about, being pure. I mean, being, fighting the dark night that Chris has set out. And that's the sort of bleakest analysis. So yes, I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you're saying, but maybe we should focus less time on them and more time on the poor old voter.
Yep. Totally agree.
Thank you.
Do you want me to come in now?
Yeah, I feel like.
Okay. Well, I think there's two aspects to the civility question. Clearly tone and tenor and the way that we behave does impact voters, whether we're likable or not. I always say to people who doorstep for the very first time and come to me for advice, or I'm sort of training them on the doorstep, the only thing I really say to them is that voters will, residents that you speak to won't remember a single word you've ever said 30 seconds after you've left the doorstep, but they will always remember whether you were nice or not. Being nice or not is sticky. So often the words you use isn't, and that it really did tarnish our party in recent years, and also the infighting in general. I'm not just saying it was just all coming from one side, but in terms of tackling it, this is in terms of internal behaviour. We have one of the things that Keir and his team and David Evans at the party have to deal with is a cultural challenge that we have within our party, and I think we need to talk about this a bit more openly. Nobody should ever feel intimidated about coming to a party meeting, whether it be a branch meeting, a CLP meeting, or any other, or conference, and feeling intimidated or feeling they have to be careful about expressing their views, which are sincerely held, views of the left, asking sincere questions. They should never do that. And if there is an atmosphere which is created where that is the case, then we need to deal with it. And I don't see why the Labour Party, because it is a voluntary organisation in the main, needs to be treated like differently to any other. If I heard a member of my staff speaking to residents, or even speaking to another member of staff in the way I have heard people who are on the various executive positions of CLPs speaking to others and speaking to members, they would be out the door that very, very day. It would be a summary decision. And I think that kind of, we need to start managing the culture within our party, because there are some people that will respond to very straightforward rules about how we deal with each other and communicate with each other. And if there are people who can't work within that framework of rules within a party, they shouldn't be in the party. It really is as simple as that. And that's not about politics, left or right. That is about civility. And if we're not a party that respects civility internally, how the public have a right to ask, how on earth would they govern and manage the Home Office? How on earth would they manage other big departments of state? So this is the thing that I think we have to really start figuring out, the culture. And Chris, you can have the question about equality and pluralism, because I'm afraid I find that too difficult for me right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. I think those were really interesting answers. And just to quickly say on Leo's point about civility, I think one thing to stress with this dark night idea I'm talking about is that the dark night idea is about it being a moral spectrum. It's that the other side are bad, not that they're wrong. I think it should be, I don't think you have to be super civil and kind of mind your P's and Q's if you're saying that idea is nonsense. You're completely wrong about that. I think you can have robust debates, but the problem occurs once it becomes that you're a bad person, not kind of I think we can be quite robust in arguing between what we think is right without saying that, castigating another person's character or intent. That would be my answer to that. And with regards to Stella's point, it's a really interesting question, and one of the things that I quote quite a lot in the book is the book Identity and Violence by Amartya Sen, where he talks about identities being robustly plural. So the fact that someone can be have multiple facets to their identity is a really important part of it. You can be a male LGBT Tory voter who's of migrant heritage, or a whole element of things to your personality, which I think is really important to respect. And so while I don't think that the average left populist would be, obviously racist or sexist in any way necessarily, once you start entering into this populist world of goodies against baddies, ultimately you enter the realm of singular identity. You judge the whole by a part, and you start to say, you judge everything about someone based on a single part of their identity. So a good example of that was, there was a whole debate about BME MPs joining Boris Johnson's cabinet about a year ago, where a number of people were referring to people like Priti Patel as turncoats or traitors to their race and things like that. Now, I find that very unpleasant on a whole bunch of levels, but that comes from this idea that if you're in the kind of white knight column or the goodies on one side, you should be on the other, and that it's it's by its nature, populism is a very, very simplifying, and the Dark Knight myth is a very simplifying thing that reduces everything down to a single identity.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, Chris. Quickly, I'm going to bring Deborah in just to say goodbye and to leave us with any passing thoughts or comments. Then I'll take the next round.
Yeah, no, I mean, my only thanks very much for inviting me, and I just congratulations to Chris. I think the book is really interesting and makes some incredibly important points. So thanks for sharing that, and thanks for inviting me, and see you all soon. Bye bye.
Cheers, Deborah. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Right, cracking on. Next two, I have David Arnold and then Siobhan Coughlin. And we don't want too much chat about Brighton and Hove, David. Thank you very much.
Why not?
You haven't got time enough for me to tell you why. It's
You're everywhere.
You are.
Thank you.
I'd like to echo what others said about what a fantastic presentation that was. My book arrived today. I'm really looking forward to reading it. Really fantastic analysis, and there's a lot there that, I instinctively feel is right and speaks to where I am politically. But my question really is: don't parties and particularly Labour, doesn't it need to have myths and stories about itself and its cause? And don't elements of the Dark Knight and the Golden Era speak to something really important about structural inequalities in the economy and society? And although they have been simplified and distorted in the way they've been used within the populist project, there is something there potentially that's always going to be there. And I can't help reflecting on when thinking back to a period of a party's success and being involved in the party in the run-up to the 1997 election, the way in which there was a pluralism within Labour, where there were old-style class warriors, and there were people who told powerful stories that had elements of the Dark Knight in them. There were people who harked back to the Golden Era and of 45 and so on. And they were powerful, motivating stories that were a part of the project. In many ways, it was about party management and putting those in their place and ensuring that the dominant story was one about how we all needed to work together, and that did involve putting some of that, slightly on the back burner, so it didn't put too many people off.
Right, cheers, David. Siobhan.
Thank you. My question is around the point around, given the intransigence of the hard and purist left, as well as on the other side those that we would describe as populist, then what's our best course of action to win votes? And are we not better off almost ignoring those groups and focusing our efforts in other places where we've got a better chance of actually getting votes? I.e., if you look at what happened in Georgia, and that the hard work done there to get more people registered, people who would never normally be engaged with and voted, they're the people we should be doing our work with, and putting aside the battles we're never going to win with the purists.
I hear you there, sister. Okay, this time round, I'll take Chris first, then Pete, then I've got one question at the end, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, Chris.
Great, thanks a lot for both of those. David, I thought your point is a really important and central one, and is one that I, towards the end of the book, I've tried to try to sort of discuss and accommodate, because you're completely right that the risk of what I'm saying is that you end up with a very sort of technocratic politics. You drain the passion out of things. So in a certain sense, I think that you do need the myths a little bit. And I certainly found when I was a press officer for Labour Party candidates, it was very easy to slip into them. Deborah's point earlier about them being underpinning great storytelling is a really important part of this. They, in a respect here, the devil's got the best tunes. The three myths they're quite compelling. But firstly, I simply think that they'd become completely all-consuming within the Labour Party, certainly in the past 10 or 5 years. Those myths had become almost all that people believed in my view. It was quite hard to pick apart what the substance was beneath these disputes that were going on. So I agree that driving these myths out completely is probably never going to be possible within politics. But you have to have a politics which is based on respect, I think. And what the myths do is they create a very bleak view of the world, whether it's the looming dystopia presented by the Golden Era, or the kind of immoral enemy that we can never defeat presented by the Dark Knight, or whatever it is. They aren't necessarily, I don't think, that inspiring in terms of getting you up in the morning. They present quite a bleak view of the world. So I think in terms of the passion of politics, probably the thing that can really override these three myths, they'll always be there a little bit, but the thing that can really override them is thinking, blimey, we could actually make a difference here and make a change. And I think that trumps the three myths in a way, in terms of getting your imagination running. And then with Siobhan's question, I think that's really interesting, and I sort of leave that to Peter a little bit more, but I generally, I think there isn't probably a huge amount of mileage in terms of having very narrow internal arguments within the Labour Party now that we've got to the stage that we have. I think there will be a small group of people who really are on that kind of purists left that I don't think would ever really agree with anything that I've said here or anything that we've said here. But I think the point about the narratives in a way is that we need to be really careful of those narratives bleeding out beyond that group and becoming, because what they do in a way is they present the almost the gateway drug, I think, to Labour being sucked into these kind of the sort of wormhole we spent the last couple of years in. So I think that that's the real question, is how we prevent these narratives from becoming the norm within the party, if you like.
Thanks. Let me pick up on those two questions. I think, David, it's a really good point, and I don't think anyone is suggesting that we jettison either celebrating our past, telling stories about our past and our future. I think storytelling is so central to politics, you know, to political discourse. The way that we, simply because the way we converse amongst friends is to turn experiences into stories. It's so central to how we communicate as human beings. So I share your frustration, that I share your worry that the suggestion that we jettison storytelling in that kind of way would lead to something which would be quite clinical and unemotional and mechanical in its place. I think that what we've got to come to terms with our party is that sometimes our stories cease being stories and start becoming dogma. Some of our stories end up becoming written in stone, rather written on bits of, you know, what we really need is a kind of eraser where we can just modernize our stories. We need to discover storytelling which is about rooted in the future, but true to our past. And I think there are ways of doing that we need to get much better at. And finally, when it comes to storytelling, we've got to tell stories that uplift and have optimism rooted in its words and its meaning, because we've got into the trap of really enjoying and being seen to look as if we enjoy poverty and the negative sides of poverty, because stories aren't just in words, they're in pictures. And many of our political messages that go in social media and also party political broadcasts have been very, very rooted in the impacts of austerity, which are dreadful, but don't really give optimism that we have the solutions to move us past it to a better future. And I think that's what we've got to discover. But I absolutely think that stories and storytelling and, you know, myths, if you like, but as part of it, it is very important. On to winning elections. This is what I love talking about morning, noon, and night. And one of my great frustrations, real deep frustrations, is that I've only ever once in 5 years been asked to speak to a Labour affiliated organisation or any single part of the Labour family about what happened in 2015 and what the lessons are for winning an election. And that was by Labour students. And a week later, they were kicked out. So, but you can imagine my frustration. And the lesson is, yes, we have to do the mechanical, but you have to do the bread and butter of a campaign. And that has to be to get the organizational aspects absolutely right. And they did that in America. But don't kid ourselves. We can get, you know, 100% of the people who voted Labour in 1997, 2005, and 2001 registered by post. But if they end up voting for another party, it means nothing at the last minute. So we've got to get both right. We've got to have the appeal right, and we've got to have the ability for them to actually vote in numbers. They got that right in Georgia, and they got that right in Michigan, and they got that right in other places in this election. But we've got to get both aspects of it right. And this is something I care about hugely. In the run-up to 2015, in Hove and Portslade, people who campaigned there will know that we spent the first almost year of the campaign jettisoning what we were told to do with the computer system that we had at the time, which only allowed us to input the answer to 3 questions, which we were dictated to ask. We didn't do that. We went to every doorstep and asked, how are things with you? And we logged the first response. Now, I went into politics because I care about social mobility. I care about giving every young person opportunity in life. I don't want to be a Nigel Farage and smash up the establishment. I want to break open the establishment. This is what I am in politics to achieve. But when I started door knocking in Hove, and when the hundreds of volunteers started door knocking in Hove, and we logged all of the insight and wisdom and the fears and aspirations that community had, I realized that what they really cared about in a majority was the train system. So by the time 2015 came around, 18 months later, I was the biggest train nerd in Hove. That didn't mean I'm not motivated by social mobility, youth unemployment, opportunity, breaking open the establishment. It means that I realize it's a relationship with the community you seek to represent. And if they think you're in it for you and your priorities, why would they elect you if there is an alternative where, even though you disagree with them on some other things, at least they'll put your priorities first? So we have to listen to communities up and down the country. We've got to listen to what they say. And we have to accept as a party that actually using our values and principles to tackle other people's priorities first doesn't mean we're not principled, doesn't mean we don't have value. It means we're doing our jobs as people who seek to run the country. We've seen every single time people have won elections in this country, whether it be local constituency elections, whether it be local authorities and local council seats and wards, or whether it be nationwide general elections, the Labour Party has been very in touch with what the priorities of the moment are, and we have made sure that their priorities are. To just give you an example of what it took in Hove, which was a Tory seat in a very difficult time, I knew, because 34,000 people left that city every single day for work by train, and it was a miserable experience for them. By the time the election came round, I knew the timetable off by heart. I knew the year that every piece of rolling stock that left any of the 3 stations in Hove was built. So that when I knocked on a door and somebody said to me that they had a nightmare getting back from work last night, missed putting their kids to bed, missed having dinner with their partner, and missed having all of the things that they love, that gives them love and nourishment in their lives, I could say, oh, so you must have been on the 7:32 or 6:35 from Victoria. The problem with that train is, and I could go through it. And when you go through it in that kind of detail, you start to open people up that actually you are on their side. That took enormous amounts of work. And if we're going to win an election again, people have got to look at us both nationally and locally and regionally and see that every single person who is involved in the Labour Party has that dedication to solving the challenges that they face in their lives. And when we do it, we will be unassailable as a political force, and we will win elections locally, regionally, and in general elections too.
Okay,
I've waited a long time to get that off my chest, you can see.
It was well worth it. The other thing that was well worth, I think everyone here will agree with me, I think Peter's just kind of offered to be part of Progress's first pay-per-view event, and it'll be him and Andrew Adonis slugging it out to see who is the biggest progressive train nerd in the Labour Party. I mean,
he'd win because he could do historical. I can only do 2015 forward. He can do from 1889.
Stop ruining my money-making ideas. All right, I'm not going to ask you more questions as we've overrun, but basically we've overrun in a fantastic way listening to both what Chris and Pete and Deborah earlier on had to say. I will call Chris back in if there's anything you'd like to say apart from buy the book, because obviously buy the book. But Chris, you've got a minute now. You've got a minute now to finish off, and I've got some announcements. Then you can all go and have your tea or dinner. It's quite late.
Cool. Yeah, thanks very much, Nathan. I haven't got that much to say more beyond by the bit. I really appreciated everyone joining this evening, and I think it's been a useful conversation. And yeah, I hope that people read it and enjoy it, and yeah, encourages others to do the same thing. But I also really, I'm just very optimistic that we have turned a bit of a corner, and that the next 10 years can be a pluralist decade, and put all of these myths behind us, and that slowly this will become a historical book rather than something that's still, I think, a live text. But yeah, that's it for me. Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.
No, thank you again, Chris. And the superlatives this evening you're getting, I think the book is amazing. So everyone really go out and read it. I think the serious point there is actually the work that Chris has done, the work that very many of our friends and colleagues who've been campaigning against anti-Semitism have done. We've really now much more aware of the fact that on the populist left, there are very many foundational myths to which they stick to and grow around them. I think actually there's a lot of scope for Chris's book to be a foundational text for how we actually live our lives as members of the centre left in politics in a better way. And actually Deborah and I were talking earlier on that actually there's enough in this book that maybe Chris will take this conversation offline. We can do more of these by unpicking some of the themes in the book without trying to actually chuck everything into the book launch, and maybe that's something we can do next year. So thank you very much again, and thanks for coming to Progress and Policy Net for running this event. We've thoroughly enjoyed it. Quickly then, as I did promise I had some announcements. This is the first of 3, maybe 4 events we're doing at the back end of the year. So we go quiet campaigning all year, then in the last 6 weeks of the year, smack, there's probably too much of us. So today is the first of the events. On the 24th, and we'll send the Eventbrite out this week, we're doing an event reflecting on the US elections, what it means to the Democrats, and actually, crucially, what it means again for transatlantic progressivism. David Lammy has agreed to speak at that, as has Amanda Wren-Terrier, who was the political director of Hillary Clinton's 2016 election campaign. And we have a couple more invites out, hopefully with some grassroots African-American organisers to come over and talk us through the story in places like Michigan and Georgia. So we'll send the invites out for that this week. Potentially, we're also doing something about a review of the previous 12 months to coincide with the first anniversary of last year's general election. Because I think what we're quite keen on is actually, we thought 2019 was a bit of a crackers year. 2020 has quite frankly knocked it into a bit of a cocked hat. So it'd be good to actually sit and have some proper discussion, debate about how we've got through this year, what the positives are, and quite frankly, how we can all be on the front foot going into next year. Also, at the beginning of January, I think we've got some more news about how progress is evolving into next year. We've basically submarined this year because we came straight out of Keir's election, and we've now been running the Labour to Win election campaign for the NEC. So the plug there is, if you haven't yet voted and you are a member of the Labour Party, you have just under 48 hours left to cast your ballot, and cast your ballot for all 6 of the Labour to Win candidates, 1 to 6, in whichever order is most appropriate to you. And fingers crossed on Friday that we'll get a good result. But like I said, we'll be coming off the back of that with some more ideas about actually what Progress Policy Network, our colleagues in Labour First, can do to help reinvigorate organising, thinking and policy development and training across the broader centre-left. And that's very much a discussion we want to be having with all of you as a continuous discussion next year. So that's enough from me. Thanks to Pete, thanks to Deborah. Most importantly, thanks to Chris, because we wouldn't be here without him. And thanks to all of you for joining this evening. Cheers, guys. This will be going up on YouTube.
Thanks for having me.
We'll send the link.
Thanks very much.
Great
Cheers.
stuff. Thank you.
Bye.
Oh, hang on.